Name is Lazarus song. Most miracles, somebody has a withered hand or something, or something happens to it, it gets a little better. People can explain that, or even crippled or blind or something, miracles or surgery or something. But it's kind of a mic drop moment when Lazarus walks up and says, "My name's Lazarus, and I came back from the dead." You can't dispute that. And, I kind of like that. That fit in real well with the message today about resurrections and so forth, and Elijah and Lazarus. We don't hear much about Elijah when he raised this widow of Zarephath's son from the dead. I think it was more of a personal thing. It was meant for our edification down the road, but I don't know that it was Elijah was ever renowned for that. Not a whole lot was said about that, but just some background information. Ahab had become king of Israel and did evil in the sight of the Lord. That's what the Bible tells us. He married to make things worse. Or, if that brought about his problems, it probably brought about his problems. He married Jezebel, who was the daughter of Ethbaal, who was the king of Sidon. And she led him into overt pagan worship of Baal. I like to say Baal. Sounds more ominous. David built a temple and an altar in Samaria as well as an Asherah pole. That's a carving of female image. She was the goddess of fertility, so you can imagine the activities that went on around all of that in their worship services. But he did more to provoke, Ahab did more to provoke God than any of the kings prior to his time. Did more. So God sent Elijah with a message that he was going to withhold the rain for, as it turned out to be, 3 years. And Elijah delivers that message, and then Elijah goes into hiding. That's where he meets this widow of Zarephath. He met her at the gate, and of course you realize there's a famine and no rain going on during this time. I think it was during the 3rd year that he met her, maybe prior to that. But she was on her last meal. He asked her, hey, do you have some water? She gave him some water. There was a little bit of water available, I guess. This was at the city gate. Then he asked her for some bread, and she said, "Look, I've only got enough. I plan to go home, cook my son and me our last meal, and we're going to die." Because that's how short, food was. It's kind of like toilet paper was with us here a few months back. But there was no food, and she was ready to die. But then it goes on and tells us, Kings tells us about the miracle of, she did have, some flour and some oil, and that fed them for the entirety of the remainder of the famine. But then on top of it, her son gets sick. We don't know how old he is. He's fairly young, apparently. And he dies unexpectedly, obviously, and she's not happy. Not happy at all. She's kind of gets a little upset, and she says, "Oh, man of God." She knew he was a man of God and so forth, but now you've come to me. What have I done? What have you done to me? Have you come to remind me? She obviously had some sins in her background, as we all do. Have you come to remind me of my iniquity and cause the death of my son? She blamed all of this on him. So Elijah carries the boy up to Elijah's room. She had given him a room where he could stay there. And he prays over him. And I think Elijah was as shocked as anybody else that the young man came back to life. And with joy, Elijah runs down the stairs and says, "Hey, your son is alive." And that isn't, I don't know that this was published. Obviously, when the book of Kings was written, it tells us about that event. But I don't know if anybody else knew about it except the woman and the young man. They probably told other people. But it seems kind of funny that Elijah was as surprised as anybody else. And of course, obviously, we know that God healed the listened to the voice of Elijah, and the child's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah took the boy and brought him down from the upper room and gave him to his mother. There are some other events, records of people coming back to life, but it's not a resurrection to eternal life like we look forward to. It was just a resuscitation to the physical life. They all went on and died. But let's compare that to Lazarus' resurrection. There's some similarities that we'd like to take note of here this morning in the sermon. Lazarus, of course, was the brother of Mary. You know, the woman who anointed, if you remember her, she anointed Jesus with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. And of course, Lazarus was her brother. Martha was her sister as well. Lazarus is kind of an underdeveloped character in the Bible. I can make a good case that he was actually the disciple whom Jesus loved. John was commonly thought to be that person. We don't have time to go into that, but Lazarus there's a lot more to Lazarus than we realize. Especially when you look at his funeral. People that showed up and were weeping and it went on for days afterwards. But they lived in Bethany, which is just a few miles outside of Jerusalem. And Lazarus did become very sick. This is probably a slow, but he was on his deathbed for a while. So Mary sends for Jesus. Now she knew where Jesus was and how to find him. They obviously had some communication network. You know, he didn't have a GPS on him, so she could keep up with him, but she obviously knew. You know, his followers kept up with him and knew where he was at times. He gave him a schedule where he was going. But she knew where to get him. Jesus loved Martha and Mary, and as well as Lazarus. He said he loved them. The Bible goes out of its way to tell us that he loved them, which includes Lazarus. But meanwhile, Lazarus dies because it took 2 days for Jesus to decide to head in that direction. He had died. It was after 2 days. And by the time Jesus actually gets to Lazarus, he'd been dead for 4 days. And of course, when Mary and Martha see him, they basically say the same thing to him. But Mary fell at his feet, you know, and said, "Lord, if you'd been, only had been here, if you'd only been here, my brother would not have died." You know, everyone was crying. And he had been dead for 4 days. And everybody there had been crying for, you know, even after 4 days. It's kind of like, you know, an event, I think, you know, when Kennedy was assassinated, most of us were around then. I'm saying Jason might not have been around, but, you know, the nation was mourned for weeks and months at a time, if you remember that. It's kind of, you know, here's Lazarus with his funeral. I don't think it was just cultural that they would weep and mourn for this long, but he obviously had some close affiliation and relationship with people there. They would mourn his death for some reason. But and Jesus saw them weeping, and the Jews who had come also were weeping. It even moved Jesus to see all this concern and emotion over his death. They were deeply moved, and Jesus he wept, and he also was deeply moved, and said, "Where have you laid him?" You know, once he walked up to the tomb. And his spirit was troubled. And "Where have you laid him?" And they said, "Lord, come see him." And they did take him to the tomb. And Jesus wept at that time. And of course he says, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" He's spoken those words to them in the past. And after this, Jesus said, he called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" You know, the man who had been dead had come out with his hands and feet bound in strips of linen, and his face was wrapped in cloth. Of course, prior to that, you know, Mary objected. Hey, Jesus told them to remove the stone, and Mary objected and said, hey, or Martha objected and said, hey, he stinks, because there was no question about it. he was dead. But this what to picture this, Lazarus walking out of the tomb and all these, being wrapped up and so forth. This what you can imagine the emotions that people experienced at that point. And it was a convincing demonstration of Jesus' authority and a catalyst that actually led to his death. This was a catalyst that led to Jesus' death. So here I've described these two resurrections. They do have some things in common. And they aren't just historical anecdotes that we can read about. Say, hey, that's a nice story. Isn't that amazing that happened? And to be isolated by themselves. They're nice stories, obviously, but they have a little more to them in the overall picture. This was a nameless widow of Zarephath. Her life was changed, obviously, and impacted by that. The obvious point of the resurrections is that Jesus, and God alone, has the power of life and death. Jesus and Elijah did have some similar experiences and a common mission. So let's look a little closer at their prayers. In Elijah's prayer, or Elijah did pray. We don't know what he prayed over that young man, but he has a more impressive prayer prior or just subsequent to the raising of the child from dead. The third year of the drought, God tells Elijah to present himself to Ahab. I'm sure that thrilled him. Because Ahab, we can tell from what he said to Elijah when he sees him. But meanwhile, while all this was going on, Jezebel had slain and slaughtered nearly all the faithful prophets in Israel. You can imagine rounding up all the pastors and preachers around here and killing them. So that's the situation that Elijah went into. And it was obviously a public event when Elijah presented himself to Ahab. And Ahab called him, they knew that this drought and the lack of rain was caused by, or the drought was caused by Elijah. He had something to do with it. Ahab says to him, when he sees him, so you're the troubler of Israel. You're the one causing all this problem. Elijah, or Ahab confronts him. And at that time, Ahab had gathered all of Israel together, so there was a huge crowd there, including the 450 priests of Baal and the 400 priests of Asherah. And Elijah speaks up, to the people. He's addressing the people, not just with Abraham. Ahab sitting there. He speaks up, says, how long halt you between two opinions? We hear that expression all the time. It comes from Elijah, confronting the people of Israel and Ahab. If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. The people didn't say anything. Silence. So Ahab, Elijah, get the name straight here. Elijah says, I'll tell you what, get us 2 oxen, you slay them, we'll put them on a fire pit, and let's have a little demonstration of the power of God. So the pagan priests of Baal, they have their wood stacked up and the pieces of the bull on top of it, their sacrifice and so forth. And they dance around and flail around for half a day. They start in the morning, they go for half a day, and nothing happens. Dancing and wailing and carrying on. Who knows what they did. And about noon, Elijah kind of mocks them. Says, hey, maybe God's going on a bathroom break or something. You want to cry a little louder, try something else. So then they break out the swords and start cutting themselves and bleeding. And this goes on all day, all afternoon, but nothing. Nothing with that sacrifice. So about the time of the evening sacrifice, Elijah, says, hey, okay, my turn. He does the same thing. He puts the meat, he builds an altar. He puts the meat on the fire and so forth. He has him dig a trench around it. He fills the trench up with water 3 times. And then Elijah has his prayer. And this is the prayer that we want to compare it with Jesus' prayer. 1 Kings 18:37 says, "Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that these people may know you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their heart back again." Now, there's a purpose in this exhibition. And Jesus uses similar language in that. But we know what happened with Elijah. The sacrifice lit up and burned, and Elijah carried on some other activities I'll talk to in just a little bit after that. Jesus uses similar language when he calls Lazarus from the tomb. You can see that in John chapter 11, 41 and 42, where Jesus raised his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me." There's that same confidence about "Answer me, Lord, and you hearing me. I knew that you always hear me, and because of the people standing here, this miracle, this resurrection is for the people, for us to see. Because of the people standing around it, I said it, so that they may believe that you sent me." And likewise, the people at Elijah's time realized that Elijah was from God, and obviously Lazarus' resurrection proved that Jesus was God, was sent from God. So immediately after Elijah's event, his prayer, and even Jesus' prayer, there was a plot to kill. Ahab and Jezebel, Jezebel in particular, threatened to kill Elijah. We can see that in 1 Kings. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets of the sword. So immediately after the fire lit up the sacrifice, and Elijah had all those priests slain and so forth, and it upset Jezebel just a little bit. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me even more, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow at this time. It's a pretty clear threat. His life, Elijah's life. Likewise, the Pharisees, immediately after Lazarus was raised from the dead, in John chapter 11, it says, "Therefore many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw that what he had done, what Jesus had done, believed on him. Some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. So from that day on, they planned to kill him." Both of them had their lives threatened at that point. Immediately after getting the threat, I think Eddie told the story about Elijah here a while back, and I'm the only one that God, I'm here. But I don't know why, he fled, and eventually God directed him to the mountain. But an angel appeared to Elijah and fed him some bread and water a couple of times. Told him, "You're going to need to eat this because you need some strength." Anyway, the strength of that food, he journeyed 40 days and went up to the Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. And there were some earthquakes and high winds and so forth. And there God commissioned him, "Hey, you're going to ordain Jehu the king of Israel." I like Jehu. It's a good, another story for another time. But Elijah was sent to the mount. And 1 Kings chapter 19, it says, "Go forth and stand on the mountain and before the Lord." And that's where God did give him the commission and so forth. Now Jesus was in Bethany at the time when they resurrected Lazarus. And of course, Bethany's a couple of miles outside of Jerusalem, but he had to go up to Jerusalem. Everybody who goes to Jerusalem has to go up. It is a mountain. It's Mount Zion. It's a mountain. And when he did go to Jerusalem, this is shortly before, the Easter, or the Passion Week, or the week, close to Passover time, and all that. the events going on surrounding Passover and his death. John tells us the next day a large crowd who had come to the feast, but it was Passover time. This was shortly after the resurrection and the plot to kill him. They had heard Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. They took branches, he did go up, and the palm trees, and went out to meet him and began to shout, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel." So he was welcomed as he came up to the mountain as a king, to be crowned, different type of coronation than what Jehu got. But Hebrews 12 compares the two mountains, gives a contrast of the two mountains. The difference between Mount Zion and Sinai. For you have come not to a mountain that can be touched by blazing fire and darkness and gloom and whirlwind, but a blast of a trumpet and the sound of words, which sound was such as those who heard him. The sound of the words which is such that those who heard begged no further word be spoken to them. God gave the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, and they knew, hey, we don't want to hear that. They were scared. For they could not bear the command, even if a blast touches the mountain, it will be stoned, or even for beasts. And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, "I am full of fear and trembling." But you have come to the Mount Zion, or a different mountain, the mountain that Jesus went up to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, the myriads of angels. But all the events in the Old Testament, comparing these incidents right here, the book of Kings is basically the story of the succession of all the kings of Israel, and leading to the fall of both kingdoms, and in the end of the royal line of the kings of Israel. And God had promised David that somebody's always going to be on that throne. But Jesus is the greater Elijah. Jesus is the greater Moses. You've probably heard those terms before. Jesus is the greater David. Every character in the Old Testament is a little bit of something that Jesus reflects, reminds. They point to Jesus. It's kind of like we see these events. Have you ever seen a tapestry or something, a picture that's woven? On the backside of it, you got these threads, they're just wildly going everywhere. But you flip it over, you see the picture, how they all fit together. And that's the way all these events in the Old Testament, throughout the Bible, we see little threads, and we kind of focus on that thread, but we have to focus on the big picture of who Jesus was and how they're all woven together. And it does reveal a portrait of Jesus and who he is and was. I think we can see he kind of brings all this together in the Transfiguration, where, remember, Jesus took it was Peter, James, and John with him up on a mountain once again. And suddenly Moses and Elijah were there. Jesus is the greater Moses, the greater Elijah. They appeared before him. We're talking to Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "The Lord is good for us." They liked this. And how they recognized Moses and Elijah, I don't know what they did. He said, "Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I'll put us 3 shelters or tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And while Peter was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son." He's the one, not Moses, not Elijah, but this one. He's the one that I'm well pleased, in whom I'm well pleased. He's the one, my beloved Son. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell on their face and fell down in terror. But these events actually point to God's purpose in history. Why even have the kingdom? It all points to the kingdom, all points to Jesus and what's going on. It's how history flows. And the mission of the church, our purpose, what we're doing. And I think there's no greater way to be reminded of that purpose when we sing Christmas songs. They encompass the whole story about Jesus being born. These Christmas songs just kind of radiate the joy, triumph, accomplishment, optimism. Read that joy. We sang "Joy to the World" at 125. The Lord has come. He rules the world with truth and grace and makes the nations prove the glories of his righteousness, the wonders of his love. Go through, sometimes you're a little discouraged, or, hey, God, what's going on this earth? We see some things going on. We don't like it. Read the Christmas carols. Give you some optimism to see what's really going on, the big picture of what's going on. That's why, go tell it on a mountain. For unto us a child is born. All these songs. O come, Emmanuel. Silent night. O holy night. All those songs are just full of optimism and victory and accomplishment. It's done. Why is it only at Christmas time we celebrate victory and accomplishment? The whole season is full of that. And after Christmas, back to woe is me. Look at all that's going on. Jesus is king now. He's sitting at God's right hand. His kingdom isn't fully realized. We'll get there someday. There's more to come, obviously. But the war is won. There are different skirmishes from time to time. God has to correct his church. I think right now he's reminding or exposing some of the cancer in the church. There's some pastors and people that need to be exposed. There are frauds. They're leading people astray with gay marriage and so forth. And, critical race theory and so forth. All these doctrines that aren't biblical. They're teaching them. The seminaries are full of it. God is correcting some things, exposing the frauds and the liars. But that's the course of history. God has to correct us from time to time. The church for the last 60 years or so has failed. The leaders have failed. And God's, I think at this time, turning some things around. People are waking up. There are scandals, but we still should have, regardless. It's like Paul was in prison. He could sing. I don't know that he sang Christmas carols, but he could sing even though he was in shackles and chains inside a prison. Likewise, we should have that same sense of confidence and boldness about our calling, how we live our lives. But judgment is now. Jesus is, king's judge and rule. He's ruling now. John tells us that, Jesus said, the voice has not come for my sake, but for your sakes. Speaking of the voice that says, listen to him. Now is judgment upon this world. Now the rule of this world will be cast out. And if I'm lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men to myself. It's happening now. The greater Jesus, the greater Elijah, the greater Moses, the greater David, the greater Abraham, even Samson and many of these particular characters we read about. Jesus was born a man. He was sent from God. He was crucified, and he rose from the dead. Everything that was foretold and foreshadowed that event in history. The Bible foreshadows that in the Scripture. He has power over life and death and sin. He sits on that throne of David right now at God's right hand, and he's judging now. So let's live and preach that message.